Imagine it's October 1933. You're standing in a farmhouse kitchen in rural Tennessee. The woman at the table is 34 years old, but her hands look 50. She's mending a pair of work pants for the third time this year. On the stove, a pot of beans simmers. Outside, her husband is fixing a wagon wheel with a piece of scrap metal and a hammer that belonged to his father. They haven't seen cash in 11 months, but they're eating. Their children are alive. Across the county, families who were wealthier 4 years ago are now gone, relocated, dissolved, or worse. This isn't a story about resilience. It's an autopsy of what happens when the currency you depend on becomes worth less than the systems it was supposed to replace. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. During the Great Depression, the families who survived weren't the ones with the most money in 1929. They were the ones who owned things that didn't require money to be useful. This isn't theory, it's documented history. And once you see the pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. In every collapse, every currency crisis, every moment when the paper system fails and the real economy underneath it gets exposed. The common story goes like this. The stock market crashed in 1929. Banks failed, people lost their savings, unemployment skyrocketed, and everyone suffered equally until the New Deal and World War II pulled the economy out. That's the sanitized version. It's not wrong, it's just incomplete. Because what that narrative hides is the split, the quiet, brutal bifurcation that happened between two kinds of poverty. There was the poverty of people who had recently become poor, professionals, middle-class families, small business owners, people who had savings accounts, mortgages, salaried jobs. They were integrated into the monetary economy, and when that economy collapsed, they collapsed with it. Then there was the poverty of people who had always been poor, sharecroppers, subsistence farmers, rural laborers, people who lived on the margins of the cash economy, not by choice, but by exclusion. And here's the thing. The second group had a survival rate the first group didn't. Not because they were smarter, not because they worked harder, but because they owned things that retained utility when currency stopped functioning. To understand what saved people, you first have to understand what money actually is. Money is a claim on future goods and services. It works because everyone agrees it works. It has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it. You can't burn it for heat. You can't plant it and grow food. It's a coordination tool, a language. And like any language, it only functions when the people speaking it believe in it. In 1929, the United States had a highly monetized economy. More than 60% of the population lived in urban or suburban areas. Most families did not produce their own food. They earned wages, exchanged those wages for currency, and used that currency to buy goods produced by others. This system is extraordinarily efficient when it works. But it has a failure mode. When the currency system breaks, when banks collapse, when deflation spirals, when unemployment spikes and wages disappear, the entire chain breaks. You can't buy food if you have no money. You can't buy tools. You can't pay rent. The whole system locks up. And in that moment, two kinds of assets emerge. Paper assets. Okay, things whose value depends on the system continuing to function. Stocks, bonds, bank deposits, contracts, mortgages. Real assets. Things whose value is intrinsic and immediate. Food, shelter, skills, tools, animals, land. During the Great Depression, paper assets evaporated. Between 1929 and 1933, the stock market lost 89% of its value. More than 9,000 banks failed. Savings accounts vanished. Insurance policies became worthless. But real assets didn't evaporate. A chicken still laid eggs. A garden still grew tomatoes. A pair of pliers still fixed a fence. This is the mechanism. When the monetary system fails, value doesn't disappear. It relocates. It moves from abstract to concrete, from future claims to present utility. And the families who survived weren't the ones with the most claims. They were the ones with the most utility. 1. Land, even a quarter acre. Let's start with the most obvious one, land. Not land as an investment, not land as a speculative asset, land as a means of production. In 1930, approximately 25% of the U.S. population still lived on farms. But even among the urban poor, many families had access to small plots, backyard gardens, vacant lots, rental parcels on the edge of town. When the Depression hit, those plots became survival infrastructure. The federal government recognized this. In 1933, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration launched subsistence garden programs in cities across the country. In Detroit alone, more than 24,000 families grew food on vacant urban land. In New York, the city converted park space into relief gardens. These weren't hobby gardens. They were caloric engines. A well-managed quarter-acre plot can produce between 500 and 1,000 pounds of vegetables per year. For a family of 4, that's a significant portion of their annual food supply. Potatoes, beans, carrots, cabbage, tomatoes, onions. The families who had this didn't need money to eat. They needed seeds, water, and labor. And labor was the one resource nobody lacked. Compare that to the urban professional who rented an apartment, had no land, and depended entirely on grocery stores. When his paycheck stopped, his food supply stopped. The land didn't make you rich, it made you autonomous. That's the difference. 2. Tools for repair and fabrication. Here's something most people don't think about. During the Depression, the consumer goods economy collapsed, but things didn't stop breaking. Shoes wore out, clothes tore, furniture cracked, wagons broke, roofs leaked. In a functioning economy, you replace these things. You go to a store, you buy new ones, you throw the old ones away. But in 1932, there was no money to replace anything. So the question became, can you fix it yourself? The families who could, who owned hammers, saws, needles, files, wrenches, pliers, had an enormous advantage, not just for their own use, but as a form of currency. Because here's what happened. Barter economies emerged. Not as a novelty, but as the primary mode of exchange in rural and semi-rural areas. If you could repair a neighbor's plow, they'd give you eggs. If you could resole boots, you'd get a sack of cornmeal. If you could patch a leaking roof, you'd get firewood. Skills plus tools equaled economic agency. There's a 1934 survey conducted in Iowa that tracked this. Researchers found that families in rural townships conducted an average of 11 barter transactions per month. And the most common traded service wasn't labor, it was repair. The families who survived were the families who could make things last. Think about what that means. In a consumption-based economy, durability is a cost. Planned obsolescence is a feature. You're incentivized to throw things away and buy new ones because that's what keeps money flowing. But when the money stops, that whole logic inverts. Suddenly, the ability to extend the life of an object by months, by years, becomes a survival skill. The people who had tools didn't just fix their own lives, they became the infrastructure. 3. Food preservation equipment. Let's talk about something that sounds mundane but was actually life or death. Canning jars. In the 1920s, the Ball Corporation and other manufacturers sold millions of mason jars across the United States. These jars, along with pressure cookers, smokers, and root cellars, allowed families to preserve food. Most people today think of this as optional, a hobby, something you do if you like farmers markets and artisanal jams. But in the 1930s, it was the difference between eating in February and starving. Here's why. If you grow vegetables in the summer, you have a surplus. A garden plot in July will produce more tomatoes, beans, and squash than a family can eat. In a market economy, you sell the surplus. You convert it into money, and you use that money to buy food during the winter. But in 1932, there was no market. Even if you could grow extra food, you couldn't sell it because nobody had money to buy it, so the surplus rotted, unless you could preserve it. Families who owned canning equipment could take that summer surplus and store it. They could process hundreds of jars of tomatoes, beans, pickles, and fruit. They could smoke meat. They could store root vegetables in cellars that stayed cool through the winter. This wasn't luxury. This was time-shifting calories, and it worked. There are oral histories from Appalachian communities describing families who ate from the jar from November to April. Breakfast was canned apples. Lunch was canned beans. Dinner was canned tomatoes with cornbread. It was monotonous. It was barely nutritious. But it was food. The families without preservation equipment had no way to store surplus. They ate what they could in summer and went hungry in winter, or they tried to buy food with money they didn't have. This is the mechanism again, the ability to decouple production from immediate consumption. In a monetary economy, money does that for you. You produce value now, get paid, and use that payment later. But when money fails, you need a physical system to do the same thing. Canning jars were that system. 4. Livestock. Chickens, goats, rabbits. Now we get to animals. Not cows, not pigs. Those required too much feed, too much space, too much capital. We're talking about chickens, goats, rabbits. Animals that could survive on scraps and produce food consistently. A laying hen, if kept healthy, can produce 250 to 300 eggs per year. That's roughly 5 eggs per week. For a family with 4 chickens, that's 20 eggs a week, enough to feed the family and barter the surplus. Chickens eat kitchen scraps, weeds, insects, and a small amount of grain. During the Depression, grain prices collapsed. By 1933, corn was selling for 10 cents a bushel in some Midwestern markets, so cheap that farmers burned it for heat instead of selling it. If you had chickens, you could buy a bushel of corn for almost nothing and convert it into eggs, which had barter value. This is nutrient arbitrage. You're taking a low-cost input, scraps, waste grain forage, and converting it into a high-value output, protein. The same logic applied to goats. A single dairy goat could produce a quart of milk per day. That's 7 quarts a week. You could drink it, make cheese, trade it. Rabbits were even more efficient. They reproduce quickly, eat grass and vegetable scraps, and produce meat with one of the best feed-to-protein conversion ratios of any animal. There are records from Depression-era extension offices in California and Pennsylvania promoting backyard rabbit raising as a relief strategy. Families who raised rabbits could produce meat without owning land, without buying expensive feed, and without waiting months for maturity. Here's the thing that people miss. These animals weren't just food sources, they were biological machines that converted waste into value. In a functioning economy, waste is waste. You throw it away. Someone else hauls it off. But in a collapse, waste becomes input. Vegetable peels become chicken feed. Lawn clippings become goat forage. Stale bread becomes rabbit food. The families who owned these animals didn't just eat better. They had economic leverage. Because while everyone else was desperately searching for cash to buy food, they had food to trade for everything else. 5. A wood stove or heating source that didn't require utilities. Let's talk about heat. In 1930, urban heating was increasingly dependent on coal, gas, or oil delivered by utility companies and paid for with money. If you couldn't pay, you didn't get heat. In the winter of 1932-33, social workers in Chicago reported families huddling in unheated apartments, burning furniture for warmth and stuffing newspaper into broken windows. In New York, cases of cold-related illness among children spiked. But in rural areas, and among the urban poor, who still had access to older technology, families used wood stoves. A wood stove is autonomous infrastructure. It doesn't require a utility company. It doesn't require a monthly payment. It requires only wood, which in many parts of the country could be gathered, scavenged, or cut from marginal land. In rural Kentucky, families would spend the fall cutting and stacking firewood. A typical household would store 2 to 3 cords of wood for the winter. That was enough to heat a small home and cook meals for 5 months. There's a 1936 report from the Resettlement Administration describing families in the Missouri Ozarks who survived the Depression largely because they had wood stoves and access to timber. They didn't need money to stay warm. They needed an axe in labor. This is another example of the same pattern. When currency fails, autonomous systems survive. If your heating system requires money to function and you have no money, you freeze. If your heating system requires only physical access to fuel, you stay warm. The families who had wood stoves weren't wealthier. Often they were poorer. But they had designed or inherited systems that didn't depend on monetary transaction. And when the monetary system collapsed, those systems kept running. 6. Community networks and reciprocal relationships. This one is harder to quantify, but it might be the most important. During the Great Depression, formal economic systems collapsed. Banks failed, markets seized, contracts became unenforceable. But informal systems, based on trust, reciprocity, and social obligation, remained intact. In rural communities and ethnic enclaves, families survived through mutual aid. You helped your neighbor harvest, and they helped you repair your roof. You watched their children, they gave you milk. You shared tools, they shared labor. This wasn't charity, it was a parallel economy. Anthropologists call this a gift economy or reciprocal exchange system. It operates on social debt, not monetary debt. You give because you expect over time to receive, not immediately, not transactionally, but eventually. These systems existed long before the Depression, but during the Depression, they became primary. There are oral histories from Italian neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Polish communities in Detroit, and Mexican colonias in Los Angeles describing the same thing. Families pooled resources, shared food, took in relatives, and created informal safety nets. The families who were embedded in these networks survived. The families who were isolated, who had climbed into the middle class, moved to the suburbs, adopted the nuclear family model, severed ties with extended family, had no fallback. When they lost their income, they lost everything. This is the brutal irony. Upward mobility in the 1920s often meant economic isolation. You moved away from your community. You stopped depending on your neighbors. You professionalized your relationships. And when the system collapsed, you had no one. The poorer families, the ones who never left their neighborhoods, who never severed those ties, still had the network. Think about what that means. The social structures that the economic boom had rendered obsolete turned out to be the only structures that survived the collapse. Historical precedent: Weimar Germany, Soviet collapse, Argentina. This isn't unique to the Great Depression. In Weimar Germany in 1923, hyperinflation destroyed the currency. The families who survived were the ones with tangible assets, land, tools, food stores, and the ones who could barter. In the Soviet Union in the 1990s, when the ruble collapsed and the state stopped functioning, it was the families with dachas, small country plots, who survived. They grew potatoes, they preserved food, they didn't need the currency. In Argentina, in 2001, when the banking system froze and the peso collapsed, neighborhood barter clubs emerged. People traded skills, goods, and services using informal credit systems. The pattern repeats. When currency fails, value doesn't disappear. It relocates to things that have immediate intrinsic utility, and the people who survive are the people who own those things. Let's be clear. The Great Depression wasn't a natural disaster. It was a systemic failure with specific beneficiaries. Large banks that survived, like Chase National Bank and Bank of America, consolidated. They bought up failed competitors at cents on the dollar. Wealthy individuals and corporations bought land, real estate, and businesses during the collapse. By 1935, ownership of productive assets had concentrated dramatically. The Federal Reserve, established in 1913 to prevent exactly this kind of collapse, failed. Some argue it made things worse by contracting the money supply. And through it all, the families who paid the price were the ones who had believed the system was permanent. They had traded autonomy for efficiency. They had traded tangible assets for paper assets. They had trusted that the currency would hold, that the banks were safe, that the market would recover, and they were wrong. Why the system couldn't end any other way. By 1929, the U.S. economy was structurally fragile. Household debt was at record highs. Margin debt in the stock market was extreme. Wealth inequality was comparable to today. The financial sector had decoupled from the productive economy. And the currency itself, still partially tied to gold, was rigid. When deflation set in, there was no mechanism to inject liquidity quickly enough. The system had three options. 1, let deflation run its course and let millions starve. 2, abandon the gold standard and devalue the currency. 3, massively expand government intervention. The U.S. eventually did all three, but it took years. And in the meantime, the families who survived were the ones who didn't need the system to work. We live in the most monetized economy in human history. Most people cannot produce their own food. Most people cannot repair their own tools. Most people do not own land. Most people have no autonomous heating, no preservation systems, no livestock. We depend entirely on the currency system functioning. And the currency system depends entirely on trust. When you look at what saved families during the Great Depression, you're not looking at quaint nostalgia. You're looking at the things that retain value when abstraction fails. Land, tools, skills, food systems, animals, community. These aren't investments, they're infrastructure. And the families who survived the last collapse weren't the ones with the most money. They were the ones who had built systems that didn't require money to work. This is historical and educational analysis, not financial or investment advice. The question isn't whether the system is fragile. The question is, what do you own that doesn't require the system to be useful? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the pattern is already in motion. Most people never see these patterns until it's too late. This channel exists to study the autopsies before they repeat.